Your Excellencies, guests, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me thank the Yemeni Businessmen Club, Syed, and the organizers of this event for inviting Hawkmة to participate in this exciting initiative. We at Hawkmة remember your very impressive first conference last year, which we participated in, where a clear interest in corporate governance was shown by both the private and public sectors. We are very supportive of your initiative to take that initial interest forward and develop a code of corporate governance for Yemen. Hawkmة, a Dubai-based regional organization advocating corporate governance reform, was created to foster more cooperation and information sharing among MENA countries and companies on their experiences towards developing corporate governance frameworks. And more importantly, building the buy-in from key stakeholders to ensure that these corporate governance frameworks are realistic and can be implemented. We realize, as John said, that corporate governance cannot be imported from outside, which is why the task force, where you bring in together experts, practitioners, and the private sector in a constructive dialogue on the way forward, play a very important role. We congratulate Yemen for taking this very important step forward, and we would like to assure you that Hawkmة will be there to support your initiatives. Let me take a step back and give you a little bit of background on Hawkmة. Hawkmة was created to bridge the corporate governance gap in the region. We operate in the Middle East and North Africa and work with countries and companies of the region to develop sound, homegrown, and globally well-integrated corporate governance frameworks. We were founded in partnership with international organizations such as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, International Finance Corporation, SITE, Union of Arab Banks, Dubai International Financial Center, Young Arab Leaders, and others. Over the 2 years that we've been existing, we've built strategic relationships with various international and regional organizations and authorities to get their buy-in and support for corporate governance reform. We've signed MOUs with diverse institutions that are crucial for the region to move forward in corporate governance, from internal audit institutes, Association of Accountants, and insolvency professionals to regulatory bodies. We've signed close to 30 now. And I know that we've signed an MOU with the Yemeni Ministry of Finance last year, and we're looking to engage them in our regional work. With various international and regional organizations, we've launched regional task forces, like we're doing now in Yemen, to bring together experts and regulators to identify current corporate governance practices through surveys and task force meetings and develop policy briefs on how to improve these practices towards international standards. We've launched regional task forces for banks with the OECD. We've actually developed a policy brief for banks. And the next step now is to work with central banks of the region to implement the policy brief. We have launched a task force on corporate governance for state-owned enterprises. We are in a data collection stage, and we've invited various countries of the region, going into 9 now, that are buying into this regional task force initiative. We have also launched programs. We've also launched programs for insolvency, regional task force in insolvency and creditor rights, and also a program on the insurance, corporate governance of the insurance industry with the Arab Federation of Insurance Regulatory Commissions. In the course of our regional work, we've found an interesting set of developments, particularly in the GCC on corporate governance. In late 2006, early 2007, we conducted 2 sets of surveys to assess the corporate governance environment in the region. The first one, we partnered with the Institute for International Finance. The Institute for International Finance is an organization based in Washington, but they have as their members some of the world's leading global financial institutions. One of the very interesting things about IIF is that they've developed a 54 criteria model of what institutional international investors are looking for, specifically on corporate governance when they're making investment decisions. So we used that methodology to go to all 6 GCC countries. We met with 100 teachers, accountants, lawyers, private sector people to assess the corporate governance environment. We looked at minority shareholder rights, structure and responsibilities of the board of directors, accounting and auditing, transparency and ownership and control, and the regulatory environment. And we basically ranked the 6 GCC countries on these various indicators. And we found that, Oman was more advanced on the corporate governance environment front, and Qatar lagging behind a little bit. And mind you, this was done in September 2006. We found that clearly the regulators were focused on corporate governance and have put in place a series of corporate governance regulations. Central banks, because of Basel II, have been working with their banks to put in place a semblance of a corporate governance framework. And many of the capital market authorities in the GCC have put in place or are in the process of putting in place corporate governance frameworks. Shortly after we released the reports, the Saudi Capital Market Authority issued their corporate governance guidelines, and so did the UAE's Security and Commodities Authority. The Qataris are now in the process of developing their code and are looking to put in place a corporate governance framework based on international practices. What we found interesting in our meetings with these 100 regulators, over 100 regulators, was that the private sector initially generally resisted to the framework. However, the capital market authorities are quite keen on implementing their codes, no matter what. So we launched another survey, this time with the International Finance Corporation. This is to gauge the level of implementation of corporate governance within the private sector. Our survey targeted 400 CEOs of the regional companies. And these are not multinational companies operating in the region. These are regional companies, and sought to ask a series of corporate governance-related questions. What I will show you are 3 of the more interesting ones as to the development of corporate governance from a private sector perspective in the region. One of the questions that we asked was whether they've heard of corporate governance. You will see about 64% of banks have heard of cite corporate governance as very important, and 34.3% of listed companies cite corporate governance as important. However, if you ask them to define what corporate governance is, only 40.8% can define what corporate governance is. So we asked them, but we actually gave them a bunch of choices, one of which is corporate social responsibility. There's been debates on corporate governance and corporate social responsibility, the day-to-day management of the company, all of that. And the other thing we've found is that the private sector is looking for specialists. 53.6% said that the reason that they could not address corporate governance is because there is a lack of qualified specialists to help with the implementation. 38% said there's a lack of information or know-how. And about 25% cited that corporate governance is lower on the priority list. So what we have here are 2 worlds. We have the regulators pushing, and we have the private sector trying to catch up. حوكمة, as I mentioned earlier, is a regional entity that works with both the public and the private sector to bridge the gap. And in the case of the region, for the private sector to catch up on their understanding of corporate governance. One of our most recent initiatives is to launch the Mudara Institute of Directors, which is focused on developing a cadre of directors who understand what it means to sit in boards and provide effective feedback to the boards in which they sit. The various duties that John earlier mentioned. Our 4-part director development program, developed jointly with the IFC, is accredited by the Institutional Shareholder Services, an organization in the US. that focuses on corporate governance ranking. And the ultimate goal here is to develop a cadre of professional directors that will add value to the region's companies. I invite the directors here to sign up on our program. We're holding these programs all over the region. There's one in Abu Dhabi in a week's time, Muscat, Dubai, and Amman in March. We're going to Casa in April, Jeddah, Casablanca, Morocco in April, Jeddah in May, and we're just exploring holding these programs, similar programs in Yemen. The bottom line here is that corporate governance is a reality in the region. It is happening. A number of initiatives, including Hawkmas, SIPEs, IFCs, OECDs, are in place, and they're all designed to work with you to develop regionally appropriate corporate governance frameworks. As these frameworks are being developed, we should learn from each other's experiences, which is why the regional links need to be strengthened, which is why Hawkmah is here. Speaking from Hawkmah's experience, and also to add to what John earlier said about private equity and the interest of private equity in corporate governance. As a Dubai-based organization, we're meeting with a lot of the private equity firms in the UAE, in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia. And we've been asking the private equity firms to what extent can Hawkmah play a role to support them. We've launched a series of programs, Asset Managers Training Program, which focuses on looking at corporate governance in the investment decision making. And one of the things that I've heard personally from various heads of asset management and institutional investment firms in Dubai and in Abu Dhabi, is that they are quite keen on looking at corporate governance as they're making investment decisions. But one of the frustrations, if you would, that they have is that the investee companies do not necessarily understand what corporate governance is. And they have asked for Hawkmah to play a role to an extent to work with investee companies in addressing corporate governance reform from the company, the private sector perspective. So in closing, we at Hawkmah are particularly delighted that the Yemeni private sector is helping drive this corporate governance initiative. It is these kinds of initiatives that are very important in building the buy-in, in educating the private sector, in getting them to understand what corporate governance is. The task force, the development of the code is just a product, but the learning process the Yemeni business community will go through as you try to understand what corporate governance actually means for you will help and ensure that there will be greater investment to Yemen and more economic growth. Thank you very much.